Dollar. Dirt and money, no soul. Had to go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack and flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money long, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.
Yup, what's good, original crew, man? We're back. Hey, we're back with another Ballen. Why I say that like you know what I'm talking about? But today's video, we got a true crime show solved this man's murder. Ooh, a true crime show? Which one?
I'm wondering too.
You said what?
I said I'm wondering too. About to find out.
Yo, back when television, I think a lot of series got us hooked on true crime. You got Unsolved. Well, Unsolved, one of the TV show back in the day. One of the first ones growing up we really watched was Bad Boy Cops.
Oh.
What you gonna do? And then
Did you used to watch this one? Let me see.
what's the one with the America's Most Wanted?
America's Most Wanted, yeah.
What's another one you looking for?
I don't know what I'm looking for.
I'm talking about like joint, like true crime. Then I used to watch the joint Oxygen. What's the one with Oxygen? Snap. Yeah, I would just watch Snap.
Like
big
first
time.
48 and stuff. But I was talking about Dateline. That's what I was talking about.
I ain't
I
watched
said, did you
Dateline.
used to watch it?
Oh, I ain't watched Dateline. Dateline used to come on Sundays. Didn't Dateline NBC used to come on Sundays?
It came on NBC. Did it come on Sundays?
I swear I feel like Dateline
I don't remember
NBC
what
used to
day of
come
the
on
week it came on,
Mondays.
but I used to watch it though. It probably did come on Sundays. I don't know.
I feel like I swear I feel like it used to come on Sundays. I don't know.
Let me see what day of the week.
All right, we look.
Okay, sorry.
Hey, make sure y'all check out the links in the description box.
Down below.
You already know where to go if you want to first support. You got to check it out down below. Also, if you enjoyed today's video,
Like it with a thumbs up.
and I know I forget it sometimes, just bear with me. But shout out to the comment of the day.
Shout out to you.
I apologize, man, if I don't get it. But it's an inside joke.
Fridays.
Friday nights.
Friday nights.
I'm trying to enjoy my life if it's coming on Friday. So I ain't watched Dayline though. I know about Dayline, but I didn't watch Dayline. All right, you ready?
Yeah.
One night in March of 2016, two friends sat on a couch in Lunel, France, watching a true crime show on TV. And the episode really hit
Ain't none of the ones we talking about. It's in France.
couch in Lunel, France, watching a true crime show on TV. And the episode really hit close to home, literally, because it was about a missing person who had vanished just miles away from where they lived. And so they're watching the show, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of it, one of the friends suddenly stood up and began pacing around the room, muttering to themselves. And when the other friend, who was still sitting on the couch watching this, asked them what was wrong, they were not ready for the answer. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a really nice, really expensive steak dinner. But make sure you first significantly dull their steak knife. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly
It's all
uploads.
good. Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Let's get into today's story. At 4:30 p.m. on June 23, 2014, 49-year-old Patrick Iswar hurried out the side door of a hospital in Sète, France, buttoning a fresh collared shirt as he ran to the parking lot. He climbed onto a scooter and then quickly checked his watch, and then he lifted the kickstand and sped off into traffic, ignoring honks from all the other drivers as he swerved between the cars. Patrick did not care who he was annoying right now, because he was running late for a date, and then right after the date, he had to rush over to his daughter's dance recital. And he desperately wanted to make sure he made both of these events, because they were some of the only things he'd had to look forward to in ages. So things in Patrique's life had not been good for a really long time. 8 years earlier, he had slipped into a rut of serious binge drinking and gambling. One day, when he was drunk, he had actually struck his wife. Following that, his wife had divorced him, and he'd lost custody of his daughter, Alabama, who was now 12 years old. After that, Patrique's life really did not get any better. He had moved in with his elderly mother, and his drinking had only gotten worse, and his gambling continued to the point where he basically gambled away most of what he made by working as a hospital janitor. And then after that, he'd gotten involved with a married coworker, and then when her husband found out about this affair, she died of an apparent suicide. Her death had been 5 years earlier, and it had been so traumatic that Patrique had barely dated since. He had just about resigned himself to a life of bachelorhood, when actually a few weeks earlier, he had gotten a call from the woman he was now going to meet, Audrey LeVay. But Patrique was now running so late for his date that he worried Audrey might not wait around for him. So he twisted the throttle of his scooter and shot across an intersection, ignoring more honks from more cars. Patrique had actually met Audrey a long time ago, right after his divorce, and they'd gone out a handful of times before they ultimately lost touch. She was a lot younger than he was, and she'd stood him up more than once in the past. But she was also a lot of fun, and it had been a while since Patrique had been on a date, so when she called him up saying she wanted to go out again, Patrique had said, sure. They'd made plans to meet this afternoon at a park near Patrique's work that had this big rocky hill rising behind it. And the place had some of the best views in the whole city, with the ocean on one side and dramatic cliffs dotted with all these old caves on the other. Now, they were not going to have a whole lot of time together, probably just enough for a short walk before Patrique would have to rush off for his daughter's dance recital later that night. But he hoped that the romantic setting might help spark something between them again. A few minutes later, Patrique pulled up to the park entrance, and to his relief, Audrey was still there waiting for him. So he parked his scooter and locked his cell phone in the scooter's underseat compartment, and he walked over to her. And from her nervous smile, he got the sense that she was almost as excited about the date as he was, which gave him a nice boost of confidence. So he took her hand, and they started down the path. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, 10 miles up the coastline from where Patrique and Audrey had been walking at that park, Patrique's older brother, Mark Iswar, stood on the deck of his boat, pulling a big oyster trap out of the water. As he was doing this, his phone rang, so he stopped and he answered it. But before he could even say hello, his mother's very worried voice came across the line, asking if he knew where Patrique was. Mark frowned because Patrique lived with their mother, so she should know better than he would. But his mother explained that Patrique hadn't come home last night. He also wasn't answering his phone, he hadn't shown up to work that morning, and perhaps most concerning of all, he'd missed his daughter's dance recital the previous evening. And it was this last fact that made Mark think that something might actually be wrong here, because he knew how much Patrique loved his daughter and how much he was looking forward to that recital. So he promised his mother he would get to the bottom of it, then he hung up and began calling Patrique's friends. However, with each conversation he had, Mark got more worried because nobody had heard from Patrique since yesterday afternoon. He'd apparently left work around 4 p.m., but he hadn't told anybody where he was going. Now for Mark, he felt like this was at least somewhere to start, Patrique's work. So he steered his boat to the dock, tied it off, and then jumped in his car and started heading that direction. 4 hours later, Mark stood on a rocky lookout point scanning the city below. Patrique's hospital stood in the middle of Set's business district, which was packed with canals and cafes and tourist spots, and Mark and a handful of Patrique's friends had spent all morning checking them one by one, looking for Patrique. But they hadn't found him or any sign of him. And so now Mark had turned his focus to some of the more remote areas around the city, like the hill behind the park where he now stood. But there was still no sign of Patrique anywhere. And so Mark was trying to think of anywhere else his brother might have gone when his phone rang. It was one of Patrique's friends from the search party, and he just found Patrique's scooter outside the park at the bottom of the hill, just a short drive from where Mark was. And so Mark told him not to touch anything, and he sprinted back to his car, and he sped down the hill, and he left the park, and he stopped in the parking lot right outside. And sure enough, there in the lot was Patrique's scooter. And as Mark looked at the scooter and at the quiet park all around him, he felt a cold weight settle in his stomach because he really couldn't think of any reason why Patrick would leave his scooter here overnight. In the back of his mind all day, Mark had been worried that something bad could have happened to his little brother. But now, after seeing this scooter, he felt sure of it. Almost 2 weeks later, at 8 a.m. on July 5th, 2014, Detective Boris Verrier took the exit ramp toward the French town of Sète. And as the sunlight hit his windshield, he had to squint as he looked out at the long stretch of beaches and canals framed by these beautiful rocky cliffs in a small, dense urban center. Verrier was a senior investigator from the nearby city of Montpellier, but he had just been called in to take over a missing persons case that had stumped the local police in Sète. About 2 weeks earlier, 49-year-old Patrick Issoire had disappeared after going on a date with a woman whose name was Audrey Louvet. The local police had already spoken to Audrey, who said she didn't know what had happened to Patrick. She said they had gone for a walk, and then he had escorted her to her bus, and then after that, she'd assumed that Patrick just sort of went back to his scooter and carried on with his night. But the scooter had been found the next day, still parked, where he and Audrey had met up for their date, with no sign of Patrick anywhere nearby. And now, almost 2 weeks later, Patrick had still not turned up. Since then, Patrick's brother, Mark, had been helping the investigation. Verrier had spoken to Mark on the phone, and Mark had talked about Patrick like he was a saint, a guy who would drop everything to help out somebody in a jam, who never got into fights and had really no enemies. But Verrier didn't necessarily believe this, because in his experience, people who inexplicably vanished oftentimes were kidnapped or murdered. Now, he had no reason to actually suspect that around Patrick. He could have just as easily gotten into an accident, fallen off a cliff, or maybe he chose to vanish. But at this point, what Verrier really needed to do was, on his own, dig into who Patrick was and figure out if there was a reason why he wasn't here right now. A few minutes later, Verrier followed Patrick's ex-wife, whose name was Claude Ozize, into her living room, and they both sat down. Verrier switched on his recording device, and he asked Claude where she was on the day Patrick went missing. Claude said it was just an ordinary Monday for her, and that after work she had picked up their daughter, Alabama, from school and driven her to her dance recital. She had expected to meet Patrick there at the recital, and it really surprised her when he didn't show up, because even though Patrick had plenty of flaws, he was a good dad. And at that, Verrier sort of leaned forward, because Patrick's flaws were actually what he wanted to know about. Now, he didn't think Claude was guilty of anything here, since she had a pretty strong alibi and didn't really stand to benefit from Patrick's disappearance. But he hoped she could maybe tell him about any old habits or current habits that could have gotten Patrick into trouble. And so when he asked her about this, Claude hesitated before saying she really didn't want to badmouth Patrick. But he drank and gambled a lot more than he should. At this point, Verrier pressed her for more details, but Claude just insisted that Patrick had really always kept that part of his life away from her. But after she thought about it for a moment, she said there was someone who might be able to tell Verrier more. And then she called their 12-year-old daughter, Alabama, into the room. Alabama appeared very visibly nervous and shaken up by everything going on with her dad. But her mother, Claude, took her hand and encouraged her to share her story. And slowly, the girl began to speak. She said that about a week before her dad disappeared, he'd brought her along on a very strange errand. They'd parked outside of a tunnel, and he'd told her to wait in the car. And then he got out and walked into this tunnel to meet with someone. It was a man. But it was too dark in the tunnel for Alabama to make out the man's features, but she definitely saw her father, Patrick, hand this man some kind of package before he quickly turned and ran back to the car. And then afterwards, her father wouldn't tell her who this man was. He just said that he'd done something really stupid, and because of it, he now owed some people a lot of money. After Alabama finished talking, her mother, Claude, thanked her and sent her back out of the room. And then once she was gone, Verrier asked Claude if she knew who this man in the tunnel might be. But Claude said she had no idea. But she said she did have one name that was worth looking into. Now, this was not someone who would have lent Patrick any money, but instead, it was a man who held a personal grudge against him. His name was Remy Chen, and he was a local hairstylist. An hour later, Verrier sat in a cramped cubicle of the Sète police station, scrolling through a file on his laptop. Based on Claude's tip, He'd looked up the hairstylist's name in the police database and had immediately found a connection to Patrick. Back in 2009, so a few years after Patrick's divorce, Patrick had been questioned as a witness in the suicide of Remy Shen's wife, a woman named Nadege Shen, who had worked with Patrick at the hospital. Apparently, Nadege had come home after a work party and confessed to Remy that she'd been having this affair with Patrick. The couple argued for hours about it, and Nadege ended up sleeping on the couch while Remy went upstairs to their bedroom. And then the next day, Remy found Nadege in their garage, hanging by the neck. As soon as Verrier was done reading this, he knew he finally had a suspect, and so he looked up Remy's last known address and contact information. At around 10 a.m. the next day, so July 7th, Verrier followed Remy Shen into an interrogation room at the Sète police station and shut the door behind them. Remy was a short, wiry man with a very obvious scowl on his face that made it clear he thought he was being very inconvenienced here. Verrier immediately got the feeling that Remy would likely only crack under intense pressure. So right away, he tried to shake Remy by saying they knew he was involved in the kidnapping of Patrick Isouard. Now, this was a total bluff because Verrier did not actually have any evidence, but he wanted to see how Remy would react. And to his surprise and irritation, Remy just laughed. Remy acted like he literally had no idea who Verrier was even talking about. And when Verrier brought up his late wife and sort of insinuated that obviously Patrick had had an affair and was a witness when she had died, Remy just scoffed and reminded him that it had been 5 years since her passing. He said he had moved on and begun dating other people. And anyways, it was sort of absurd to think that he would hold a grudge for 5 years without doing anything, but then suddenly now decide to take some sort of revenge out of the blue. It just didn't add up. But Verrier didn't really know what to make of this. It seemed like Remy was really confident, almost too confident. And so he pivoted and just asked Remy where he was on June 23rd, the day Patrick went missing. And after thinking for a moment, Remy just said that he had spent the whole afternoon alone cleaning out a storage unit that he had rented. This was obviously not a great alibi at all, but at this point, Verrier had no choice but to let Remy go. As Verrier watched Remy leave, he knew he was running out of time here. I mean, 2 weeks had already passed since Patrick's disappearance, and every day the odds of finding him alive got worse. So out of desperation, Verrier decided to circle back to the very start and speak again to Audrey Louvet. I mean, being the last person to see Patrick before he went missing, Audrey was an obvious person of interest. But Verrier wasn't sure what more he could learn from her. The local police had already questioned her at the very beginning of the investigation, and Verrier had already watched that interview tape a number of times. But Verrier knew he just had to take a shot. So he picked up the phone and he called Audrey into the station. Later that same afternoon, around 2 p.m., Verrier sat across from Audrey in the same room where he just interviewed Remy. He said hello to her and he started the recorder, and then he asked her to explain her history with Patrick again. And at first, her answers were all just like they'd been on the tape. She said they had met 8 years ago in 2006, and they'd dated casually for a while before losing contact. And then, just a few weeks ago, she happened to pass the bar where they first met, and it made her think of Patrick. So she'd called him up out of the blue to ask how he was doing, and they'd ultimately made plans to see each other again. She described their date as being a short walk around the park, after which Patrick had walked her to the bus stop and then headed off, presumably to go back to his scooter and to head off to his daughter's dance recital. And that's when Verrier interrupted, and he asked Audrey to tell him specifically which direction Patrick had headed off after dropping her off at the bus stop. And Audrey sat there for a minute, and then she said, I can't remember. And this really bothered Verrier, because here was this person who should be able to tell him the most about Patrick's last moves, and she had basically nothing useful to offer the investigation. So Verrier just sort of dropped the polite tone and really went after her. He told her he wasn't buying her act, and that she needed to tell him everything she knew right now, or this was all going to get much, much worse for her. Audrey's eyes went wide and her voice began to shake as she insisted that she'd already told them everything. But Verrier didn't let up. He kept demanding that she just admit what she'd done until he was practically shouting at her. And Audrey was in tears and she was repeating over and over that Patrick had been fine when she left him. She just didn't remember all the details. And finally, Verrier backed off. He'd run countless interrogations throughout his career, and his gut was starting to tell him that Audrey's fragility was not really an act here. He'd pushed her as hard as he could, and he had to admit that maybe she was just telling the truth. A little while later, after Audrey was gone, Verrier sat alone inside the interrogation room, thinking about the case. He hadn't managed to rule out any suspects yet, and he still had no idea who that mysterious man in the tunnel might be. And on top of all that, there was still the possibility that no crime had been committed here, since they had no body. I mean, who knows what really happened to Patrick at this point? And Verrier knew that there were just too many unknowns. And Verrier knew that if the case was ever going to gain real traction, they needed to find Patrick, dead or alive. Around 11 a.m. on July 17th, so 3.5 weeks after Patrick Isouard disappeared, Detective Boris Verrier parked along the shoulder of a winding roadside in the French town of Sète. He got out of his car, he stooped beneath a strip of yellow police tape, and he headed across the long strip of dry grass leading up to a sheer cliff wall. A dozen yards ahead of him, barely visible in the rock face, was the dark, round opening of a cave. A few hours earlier, a group of teenagers had shown up at the police station seeming very frazzled, saying they had found a human body inside of that cave. And as soon as Verrier had heard about this, he had rushed to the scene because the cave was less than a half a mile away from where Patrick's scooter had been abandoned. And so now Verrier turned on his flashlight and he stepped into the cave. And as soon as he did, a forensics team fell into step right behind him, and together they began making their way into the darkness. Thanks to his flashlight, Verrier could see that the walls were covered in graffiti and that there were empty bottles and other garbage everywhere. So it seemed like this was probably a popular party spot for young people. As they moved deeper, the cave split off into a maze of all these different narrow tunnels. And just as Verrier was about to direct his team to spread out and begin searching all of them, he passed by one of these tunnels that absolutely reeked. And so Verrier stopped what he was doing and just aimed his flashlight down this particular tunnel. And he saw there was a shallow pit dug into the floor. And lying at the bottom of this pit was what looked like a ragged lump of black fabric, until Verrier stepped closer. The smell was overpowering now, and Verrier knew he was standing over the charred remains of a human body. Verrier bent down to examine it, and he saw right away there was what appeared to be a bullet hole in the skull and a bullet hole to the torso. And those details, one to the head, one to the stomach, and then, the body being burnt afterwards, likely to get rid of evidence, felt very familiar to Verrier. It felt like this could have been a mob hit. A year and a half later, so just before Christmas of 2015, Detective Verrier was in his office in Montpellier when his phone rang. It was Patrick's older brother, Marc, calling to ask for updates on his brother's case, again. And Verrier sighed because the truth was, he had nothing new to report. The body in the cave had been confirmed to be Patrick, and so Verrier had hoped that that discovery would lead to all these new leads. But after scouring the cave for clues and testing the cigarettes from the scene for DNA and speaking to the teenagers who reported the body, the case just hit a dead end. Now, the mob-like execution style did line up with a theory that Verrier had that, maybe Patrick had been killed over a gambling debt, by the mob basically, or someone who was affiliated with, organized crime. But Verrier had never been able to actually uncover any trace of Patrick having any sort of debt that would get him killed. Also, he still had not been able to identify that mysterious man in the tunnel that Patrick's daughter had mentioned. And so that left Remy and also Audrey as his only suspects. And Verrier had placed both of them under surveillance, but so far, neither of them had done anything suspicious. So the investigation was now stuck. And
Could Remy possibly put out a hit, right? And Audrey was used as the setup?
But then I guess you'll have to.
That sounds too Hollywood, though.
I mean,
it just sounds too Hollywood.
But I guess you'll have to what are their connections?
Or does Audrey got a connection to the people that Remy would have put up the hit for? You know, because Audrey stepping in a picture around this time is kind of weird. You blew him off previously before then, all because I walked past a bar. It drew me to want to contact him because I walked past a bar we both visited. But you had stood him up several times before. And Remy, your wife confessed to you about an affair,
Yeah.
and the next day you find her deceased.
Mm-hmm.
That right there, and they bought that
Yeah.
in 2011 because what it had to been 2011 because that was 5 years previously before 2016
Yeah.
when Patrick went missing.
Yeah.
So, but they bought that in big 2011. In the year of 2011.
I guess they wouldn't have had much, especially how they found her, how
Now
she was deceased.
Now, how many times we've seen people stage?
Yeah,
like that?
I agree. I'm saying they probably
I'm
didn't
not
have
doing that
much
to
to
you.
like.
I'm not doing it to you. But I see if it was 1811, I'd be like, yeah, you know what I'm saying? Y'all ain't thinking like that. But in big 2011,
Right. Yeah.
Neither of them had done anything suspicious. So the investigation was now stuck, and Verrier understood that Patrick's family was really out of patience here. So he was not surprised that when he admitted he still was not ready to make an arrest, Mark snapped. He told Verrier that if the police weren't capable of solving this, he was going to take matters into his own hands. 3 months later, on a night in March of 2016, Detective Verrier sat down on his couch in his living room to watch something that he'd been warned was coming. Mark had convinced the producers of a national true crime TV show to do an episode on his brother's case, and the episode was airing tonight. And as the show started, Verrier felt a knot of anxiety because Mark knew details about the investigation that were not meant for the public. And if he shared them on this show, it could seriously compromise the case. But obviously, Verrier was also just curious to see how the episode had turned out. And part of him hoped that maybe renewed public attention might actually help the case. And as Verrier watched the show, he was relieved to see that Mark wasn't there to talk about case specifics. He was there to talk about Patrick. Mark described his brother as this hardworking father who never seemed to catch a break in life, and who at the very least deserved justice. And at the end, he put out a simple plea for anyone with information to please come forward. When the show ended, Verrier did not really feel worried anymore that anything that had been revealed on the show was sensitive or that it could negatively impact the actual investigation. But he also knew that, the impact the show was going to have was probably going to be pretty small. Like, he didn't expect anything to come of this plea for help from the public. However, he would be wrong, because the next morning, Verrier's phone would ring. And an hour after that call came in, Verrier was ringing the doorbell of an apartment building in Lunel, which is a town close to Set. A woman would answer the door, and when Verrier flashed his badge, she invited him inside. The woman, whose name was Sophie, had reached out to the police after watching Mark's interview on TV, saying she did have information about Patrick's case. And so Verrier followed her into her kitchen, and he sat down across the table from her, and he turned on his recorder, and he told her to just start from the beginning. And the moment the story began to spill out, Verrier knew he'd solved the case. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and witness testimony, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patrick Iswar on the afternoon of Monday, June 23, 2014. At 4:30 p.m., the killer stood on a rocky hill overlooking a park in Set, watching through a pair of binoculars while Patrick and Audrey walked hand in hand down a paved path below. The couple was taking their time, clearly enjoying the scenery and each other's company, and then at some point, Audrey stopped and pointed across the road at a cave in the nearby cliffs, the entrance to a cave. And when the killer saw this, their heart began to race, and they watched intently as the couple actually crossed the road and went into the cave and vanished. At this point, the killer lowered their binoculars and put them inside of the large duffel bag they had brought with them. Then, after slinging this bag, they hustled down the hill and went right to the entrance of the cave. When they reached the entrance to the cave, they stopped, and they put that bag on the ground. They unzipped it, and out of it, they pulled a large rifle, a roll of duct tape, and also a white mask. The killer put the mask on, and with the rifle and tape in hand, they entered the cave. And they could hear the sound of Patrick and Audrey inside. They had not gone far, and they clearly had not clocked the killer coming in. They were sort of wrapped up in their date. However, when the killer got close enough, the couple heard their footsteps, and they turned around. When Audrey saw the killer in their mask with the gun, she began to scream, and Patrick, he just went white as a ghost. Before the couple could even react, the killer threw the duct tape at Audrey and told her that if she wanted to live, she would do exactly as instructed. Then the killer told Audrey to use this tape and bind Patrick's wrists and ankles. And at first, Audrey just stood there in stunned silence, but eventually she composed herself and she obeyed. And as she was binding Patrick just also stood there in stunned silence, not really sure what to even do. When Audrey was done, the killer told her to leave the cave and to not say anything about what had happened to her. She hesitated just long enough to glance back at Patrick, but then she turned and she ran. Once her footsteps had faded and it was just the killer and Patrick inside of this cave, Patrick just stared, wondering what was going to happen to him, and the killer, after making really intense eye contact with Patrick, raised his rifle and shot Patrick in the head and also once in the chest, and Patrick crumpled to the ground. At that point, the killer slung his rifle, and then he grabbed Patrick by the ankles and he dragged his body down a nearby tunnel and dumped him in that shallow pit. Then the killer doused the body with lighter fluid from a canister they'd brought in that bag. They lit a match and tossed it in. As Patrick's body began to burn, the killer walked out of the cave and pulled off their mask as soon as they stepped into the light. They now had only one thing left to do: go find Audrey and explain everything, and convince her not to go to the police. Because the killer was Remy Shen, the hairstylist who hated Patrick for having an affair with his late wife, and he had just successfully tricked Audrey into helping him pull this murder off.
Wow.
It would turn out Audrey was actually Remy's ex-girlfriend. They had met and begun dating in 2009, shortly after the death of Remy's wife.
Shut the front door, bro.
And Remy had realized that because of Audrey's history with Patrick, because they had also dated, he could use her to lure Patrick into a trap and finally take his revenge. But even though Audrey was clearly a key part of this plan, she didn't actually know that Remy was going to kill Patrick. Remy had told her a sob story about Patrick owing him a lot of money, and she thought they were just going to scare him into paying up. It was not until she got into the cave and Remy showed up with a mask on and a rifle that she realized he had something way more sinister in his mind. After the murder, Remy convinced Audrey to stay silent by threatening to kill her and her children. And for over a year, she kept his secret, lying to the police the whole time. But when she watched that true crime episode about the case and saw Mark's plea for information, she finally just cracked and confessed to her friend Sophie, who was watching the show with her, who then went on to call the police the very next day. On March 31st, 2016, Remy Shen and Audrey Louvet were arrested for their roles in Patrick's death. Remy received 30 years in prison for murder, and Audrey was sentenced to 12 years for acting as an accessory to the kidnapping.
That's it. That's all. Wow. Rest in peace. That is so sad. For what?
Because earlier you said how are they connected?
No, I said I would need to. I need to know like how would they be connected? Oh, they dated. How? They dated.
And she was the setup. She was 100% the setup. They understand. We did need to know.
Oh, my bad.
What you was going to say?
No, we did need to know what?
The connection between the two.
Yeah.
And it sounded like a setup. But also, because they was like, hey, which way? And when he's asked that question and she couldn't answer which way he walked off, those are minute details that you would know.
You know everything else. But just this moment, like, I don't know. Because, what
and
you mean
you
don't
knew
know?
he had planned to kill that man. In a cave?
In a cave? What we going in a cave for?
If it was just going to be a robbery, I could have got him alone in a quiet area. But we going into a cave. Also, if it was a robbery, were you expect him to have some money on him? It's for something?
Yeah.
You knew that man didn't have no money.
Facts.
So he told you to lure him into a cave. You said, I thought it was just going to be a robbery. No, you knew it was going to be a homicide, bro. Come on. In a dark cave? Ducked off?
And 30 years ain't enough. For Remy, the way you did, bro.
And
12 ain't enough for her because she knew.
And you talking about some, I didn't know, like, then he just threw me the duct tape.
And then you done lied all these years.
And that guilt just got to you. And ain't no telling what Sophia was saying when she was with you to make you be like, Sophie, to make you be like, all right.
Probably whoever did this is a terrible person, a monster, whore. Like I would have been saying,
and she probably felt so bad because you know what I'm saying.
Wow,
that sucks, bro. So sad.
And like he said, Remy was too overly confident, I done moved on. It was 5 years ago.
And he
moved
did,
on quick.
honestly.
I mean, 5 years is a long time, but still, the way that your wife was it's just
no.
Go ahead.
The way his wife was what? Stay on that part.
I was about to say just the way that your wife died is just very one is fishy.
He killed his wife.
One is fishy. Why would she come home and confess to you that she did this?
And then
take her life. One, we don't even know if she technically confessed to you. That's just your story. That you could have found out that she was doing. You know what I'm saying? Because we don't know her side. And the next day she
just all of a sudden you wake up after she confessed. Why y'all?
Because why would I confess to you and then take my life?
And my bad. It was in 2009, but still 2009 is still hey, y'all should have been smart enough to look more deep into.
Oh, you talking about with? Oh, yeah.
When she died in 2009, y'all just took that as a word and instead of doing a proper investigation, did we see possibility of everything? Sometimes the situation she could have died before there's ways to investigate a crime like that.
Could have been strangled and then placed up there.
Yeah,
or something
there's a way
you
can investigate it and know whether or not what was said was true or not.
Yeah,
but. We can't linger back to that part. We can only go from here. And no, he didn't get over that. You immediately start dating right after your wife tragically takes her. You know, people go through. Don't do that.
No.
A lot of people don't do that because you would have been. Even though she did that, I had no clue. I had no clue until that day. So I'm left with a lot of answers of why. Why would you do that? Why would you leave me? We could have worked this out. There would have been a lot of things that you would still be mourning. But that same year she takes her own life, you start dating Audrey.
And you took her life and you was like, the next person I have to get.
But you couldn't do it right away. You had to plan it to a degree where there was a big gap. Because if you had did that to her, then right behind that dude did it to Patrice, then all eyes would have went to you. Because you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's so sad, bro.
And Audrey, I walked past the bar and they put me in the mind of him, and I just knew it.
Caught on me.
No, are we really gonna buy that, bro? Damn low IQ.
And yes, she probably was in there doing all that crying and sobbing because she know what happened. You know what I'm saying? You feel like it was it's because, because I'm pressuring her and she really don't know. No, she knows. And she's like, I can't tell you because this person also threatened me. Did you really? I mean, I guess, especially if you probably. Well, no, I doubt he done never told you if he actually did that to his.
Nah,
his wife. I doubt that.
I
don't think he did.
I don't think he'll open up
and didn't say that.
Yeah.
But yeah. Definitely rest in peace, because
Facts.
what?
Don't even make sense, man.
No sense.
But hey, y'all spin us up. Y'all let us know y'all thoughts about it for us in the comments down below for us, man. But until next time, y'all know how it go, man. I do go by the name DJ New Kid. This is
Cee Reacts To A.
We are.
Kid and Cee.
We out.
Time to kick it, got a stack of flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money low, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.